Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We don't look as if we've got that many participants tonight, but I hope that people will join us as we move forward. Tonight, I'm really pleased to introduce a very old friend of mine, Chris Weston, who is at the University of Melbourne in Australia. Chris is a forest ecologist with interests in recovery of eucalyptus forests from fire, forest soils and nutrient cycling, and forest ecosystem carbon balances. He could actually be doing work over in Los Angeles because I think a lot of the fires are associated with old plantings of eucalyptus there, which were maybe a bit of a mistake. He has extensive experience teaching undergraduate and graduate courses in forest soils and ecosystem ecology, and his recent research projects have addressed the sustainable management of Eucalyptus pellita plantations in the Tiwi Islands. The Tiwi Islands, for those of you who don't know, are in northern Australia, between Australia and Papua New Guinea. He's been looking at the impacts of the repeated burning of native sieberi forests in eastern Australia and the fire tolerance of eucalypt species of differing bark type. Again, if you don't know, there are, I don't know how many species of eucalypt, several hundred, I believe. Is it 600 or something?
About
And
that,
some of them have got incredibly hard bark, like some of the iron barks, and some of them have got very soft barks, like many of the gums. Recently, Chris was asked to contribute a postgraduate subject on forest carbon to a 4-subject graduate certificate in forestry administered through the University of Tasmania, which is in the south end of Australia, another island. Experience in developing and teaching this subject will be the focus of his talk tonight or today or this morning, depending on where you are, in the AP-FECM webinar series. So the topic is forestry education in Australia, engaging the forest sector. So all yours, Chris.
Thank you, John, for that introduction. And I'll just share my presentation. Hopefully the technology will come through. If I could just get a verbal confirmation that you can see a starting slide.
Yes, I can.
Okay. So the place to start tonight, I guess, is to talk a little bit about the context for forestry education in Australia, recognising that forestry education has a different context in each country where it's taught. So tonight's focus is Australia, and I'll try to give you a flavour for what's going on and the fate of, I guess, specific or applied forestry education within the tertiary sector in Australia over the last 15 to 20 years. So when this slide was taken, John, you may remember this is a slide on the left-hand side of the screen from 2008. We were launching through a collection of universities in Australia, including ANU and Southern Cross Uni. Not sure if UTAS was involved, Melbourne. A forestry master's program that was first offered in 2008. And it was labelled a Master of Forest Ecosystem Science at the University of Melbourne, and that master coursework program ran for 10 or 11 years and was transformed again in 2018 into a more generalised ecosystem management and conservation master. And at the same time, at the other universities in Australia, the name of forestry courses gradually fell out of the handbook, so that I think eventually the only university in Australia offering something specific to forestry education and labelled as such was Southern Cross University, which I believe still has a forestry labelled undergraduate program. So tonight I'm going to have been asked by the AP-F network to present on my experience in presenting one of the 2 subjects that was taught in a new effort to create or to revitalise forestry education that was begun really by the forestry sector itself. So I'll explain that as I go along. But first of all, I'm just going to run through a few slides on the Australian context before we talk about forestry education in particular. The slide on the right there is a slide of a coop in Victoria, a logging coop at Talangi. And you can see there is a habitat tree, tree seed, retained trees on a fairly large logging coop. And we no longer access native forests to remove timber for the timber industry anymore in Victoria. We've ceased all logging of native forests other than the retrieval of wood for firewood purposes. Getting into this screen, but I wanted first to reflect on the different contexts for forestry education globally. In some countries, forests are accessed for food and fuel. In fact, this is the major purpose in most of the countries around the world, with the collection of fruits and tubers and all sorts of items from the forest that are directly used in small villages for human consumption. In some other countries, bottom right here, this is a photograph taken in Southeast Asia. There is a lot of manual labor involved in the processing of small pieces into locally used products, and some products that go further into sawmills and panel mills and so on. Bottom right, people in UBC and in Canada can probably recognize that as a landscape of highly mechanized forest operations in one of the valleys in inner British Columbia. In Australia, as in elsewhere, this photograph in the middle panel on the left, there is a rising importance of Indigenous-owned forestry enterprises. And here, the Indigenous owners are working with plantation experts in the Tiwi Islands to grow trees directly for the benefit of the local communities, to eventually provide jobs as well as incomes to improve conditions on the island. So servicing the needs of all of these different types of forestry will dictate what comes forward in each country in terms of the requirements for foresters to look after the forests in each of those situations. The top panel, by the way, is the forestry complex at Eucalyptus on the Tiwi Islands. And the bottom panel here is on the left is the highly vertically integrated plantation growing and processing enterprise of the Green Triangle area of South Australia and southwestern Victoria. In terms of where we're at with forestry education in Australia, we have a location in the Southern Hemisphere where we're fairly isolated from the rest of the world. I think Perth is one of the most isolated cities in the world down here in southwest WA, but also Melbourne and even Sydney are fairly isolated with the vast expanse of the Pacific to South America and the US. And we tend to receive postgraduate students mostly rather than undergraduate students into forest-related research-based programs from Southeast Asia, principally from China, more so from India recently, a lot of students from Indonesia, but also the Philippines and Vietnam, so that we've got a lot of students who are studying forestry type subjects, but they're generally not within forestry labelled programs. They're in more generalised Master of Science degrees or perhaps Master of Environment. As you can see, the context for forestry in Australia, as you'll see by the next slide, our forests are largely distributed around the coast, and it's in the 500 millimetres rainfall and above zones that forestry is based. So if you look at a relief map of Australia, you can see we have some ranges on the eastern side extending all the way up into Queensland, a central basin that drains the western edge of those ranges, and then the West Australian shield of relatively higher and much older country. But sorry, that's dipped on. The forestry is based in southwest Western Australia near the coast. It's based in southern Victoria and eastern Victoria, and then on and around the ranges extending up into Queensland. And over this range of environments, the species that are important in plantation forestry change, and the emphasis on plantations versus native forests skips from states that have native forest logging remaining, which includes New South Wales and Queensland and Tasmania, but not Victoria, where I'm sitting anymore. So when I talk about the forest sector in Australia, I'm talking largely about industrial forestry that grows plantations in straight lines and is highly mechanized, so that there is usually a detailed GIS basis for managing plantations on rotations of anywhere between 25 to 35 or so years. The main species for hardwoods in Australia are the Eucalyptus globulus and Eucalyptus nitens in Tasmania, adapted for colder climates. There's around about 600,000 hectares or so of these hardwood species. And then a greater area of Pinus species, dominated by Pinus radiata in southern Australia and Western Australia as well. But as you move into the more subtropical climates, warm temperate climates, then pines from the Caribbean, Pinus caribea and Pinus elliottii, form the major plantation species in Queensland. And they have some different eucalypts growing on and around the border of Queensland and New South Wales. So forestry in Australia is based mainly in plantations now in terms of value of products, and increasingly so in terms of volume of products. And this is because of the decline of native forest utilisation and an increasing emphasis on the potential and maintaining the productivity and expanding the plantation forestry base. Now, ironically, over the last 5 years, Australia's plantation forests have shrunk in area, as areas that were established under managed investment schemes throughout the early 2000s up to around about 2006 or 7, the leases on the land expire for forestry, and in many cases, the areas of land have reverted to agriculture. So our plantation area has declined from around about 2 million hectares to around about 1.6 or 7 million hectares over the last 10 years. So the photograph on the top there is the Eucalyptus regnans forests that are highly productive, that formed a large part of the utilisation of forests in Victoria. These are no longer accessible to the timber industry, and plantation forestry is now the emphasis for forestry education that's focused on forest production in Australia. So that's a key point. I had the privilege last week of doing some field work in Tasmania. This is what native forest utilisation looks like down there in the Huon Valley, a very productive valley that grows the world's tallest flowering plants, and also some very productive native forests that have been accessed and timber removed, perhaps over 2 or 3 rotations over 150 or more years. And what we're now seeing more of is accessing these forests of plantation species here, hardwood plantation, Eucalyptus regnans again. So around about 2 to 3 years ago, representatives from the industrial plantation industry base, companies such as New South Wales State Forests or Sustainable Timbers Tasmania, or Hancock Victorian Plantations, Hancock Queensland Plantations, got together with some academics at a conference, forestry conference in Albury, and decided that for a range of reasons, which we'll go into next, something needed to be done to address the shortage of qualified people coming out of universities who were highly employable immediately within the forestry industry. So the industry is really focused on these types of plantations, industry plantations on owned land, as well as joint venture plantations. But we're generally focusing on plantations where there's an emphasis on productivity and where there is an increasing scale of planting. So large land bases, 150, 200,000 hectare base, and then what's required in terms of educated graduates to manage that scale of plantations. So I wasn't involved in the committee for the future of forestry education in Australia. I was languishing somewhere else rather than at a forestry conference back there a couple of years ago. But they then came to me to ask me to teach the second course as it was to be offered within the program that they decided to run. But the background is that these commercial forest growers are facing a shortage of skilled forestry professionals. It's hard to get all of the skills in one graduate. They may have some skills, but not the skills that extend from forest ecology through accounting and social extension into social landscapes, as well as a range of other skills such as GIS and sampling theory and all the rest of it that goes with forestry graduates. So given the age profile of the current forestry professionals, the shortage is predicted to increase, and they decided that something needed to be done. So I really covered the first point here. Forest growers are recruiting graduates that have more general environmental science and agriculture qualifications, but they lack some of the specialist forestry knowledge that the industry seeks. And this limits their future career paths and potential for sustainable growth in the sector. So the industry really recognised that they have the best possible people who they can access through the jobs market at the moment. Perhaps the best way to go is to upskill these people in the job so that they can be of increased value, I guess, and efficiency within the roles that they play within the different organisations. So where we've got to is that the forest sector or forest industry, together with around about 8 Australian universities, are working together to develop the program. And it's being spearheaded by Mark Hunt, Professor Mark Hunt at the University of Tasmania. Perhaps Mark is online and can comment a bit more on this process later. And the first subjects for the program that they decided to create were offered in 2024, so last year. And really these first 2 subjects, the first one, sorry, I'll go on to that point in a minute. The program is being designed as a nested graduate certificate of 4 coursework forestry units or subjects or courses, which can then lead to a graduate diploma of 8 units with the study of 4 further units. So Mark is putting the paperwork through the University of Tasmania system, and many of you will know it takes 2 years, sometimes more, to establish a new program. So he's midway through that process. But in the meantime, 2 subjects have been offered which can be taken into the award once it's created through the University of Tasmania. So to enable that process to happen, Peter Konofsky offered a course through ANU in March 2024, and at Melbourne we offered one in September 24, focusing on forest carbon. So at Melbourne we used what we call the Community Access Program to rapidly allow people, members of the public, to enrol in a subject. We used an existing subject within the handbook that pretty much mirrored what the industry wanted in terms of a forest carbon subject, and we ran it. And I will kind of move on to talk about that next and our experience. But before I do, for those of you who are interested, and I encourage you to contact Mark Hunt for further details, these are the sorts of subjects that will be created by the program and taught this coming year or this year and in the for the next 2 to 3 years. I believe the program with the forest industry actually providing the students into the courses, into the subjects, where the employer from forest industry pays for the tuition fees for their employee to come and study within the university environment. So for university, it means you're getting full fee kind of public community access program students into a subject, and it makes it well worthwhile because the industry has guaranteed 20 students each year, for each subject. And I believe that the first subject, which is running at the moment for the 2025 version through with Peter Konoski leading, has an enrolment of 23. Okay, so I really just want to spend the rest of the time reflecting on how we went in terms of offering carbon forestry subjects through Melbourne. We taught it over 2 months, essentially, and maybe one more week into November. We had 17 industry-funded students into the program. The students studied online before and after a residential teaching week. The model we came up with was to have 7 weeks of 1 day a week. We chose a Thursday, and from Thursday from 5:30 to 7 p.m. we ran tutorial and discussions using a Canvas LMS learning management system base, and students would enter discussions and readings from 1 week to the next to bring them into the subject area and to prepare themselves really for more intensive interactions during a 5-day residential teaching week, which we ran through the Creswick campus. And following the residential week, we then finished with 2 more weeks of online, mostly dealing with assignment work and following up on anything that had come up during the residential week that warranted discussion. So here's our group of 17 students, and you can see in the middle here in the white t-shirt next to me is Professor Mark Hunt. Mark fortunately was able to make it over and be part of the experience and contributed to the teaching. Certainly very pleased to have him here. And I guess I'll say straight up here is that in comparison to forestry coursework subjects that I teach through the main campus in Parkville, for example, I run an agroforestry course which had 60 students enrolled last year. I would see maybe 45 of those in the first lecture, and then I would see no more than 15 or 20 for the rest of semester. If you engage the forest sector through a program such as this one, then every student turns up to the residential week. Everyone's engaged in every session. It was like teaching 20 years ago in terms of the interest and enthusiasm and the ability of the students to enter the material, take over the learning themselves, discuss it. I've never had such a positive teaching experience as with this group of people in this carbon forestry subject. The online mechanism for the teaching, and many of you will be familiar with learning management systems, but I've provided a snapshot here and don't expect you to read the fine detail, but the material is organised such that they have a welcome and subject information tabs. And then for each week, we call it a module, and a module will generally have a theme, and the students can click on the module name and it will include a brief perspective on what we hope they will gain from the module, some readings and materials, some questions for thought, and a quiz. And the basis is that they would enter that module prior to coming into the 1.5 hour tutorial, and we would essentially discuss what's in there rather than have a lecture type format during that 1.5 hours. We had lots of banter with the students through the announcement process, and they seem to be able to access the online materials and to get what they needed without too much instruction. I will say that for people coming in from industry who haven't dealt with university learning management systems, there was a bit of a hurdle to get over in terms of becoming familiar with how these things work. But fortunately, the Australian National University and University of Melbourne, and I believe UTAS, all share the Canvas environment. Some of the other universities use a different one, but that can be a key point to look out for in terms of running an effective course with people who are coming back from a job and they haven't been in a university environment for perhaps 10, 15, 20, or even more years. We adopted a kind of collaborative learning type approach where the students would sit at tables and tasks were handed out, and the tables were the basis for discussion and perhaps calculations and making some presentation on what they'd found. But the idea was to use the mornings from around about 9 until 1 to bring in experts from the, let's call it the carbon industry. And we had people volunteering in from CSIRO, from a range of, from other universities, from consulting companies. And I sensed that there was kind of a built-up urge, given the lack of opportunity for some of these people to contribute to forestry education over the last decade. They were really happy to engage with this university-based group, even though they're industry people. And it really created a very positive and almost an electric atmosphere in some of the discussions that we had. The design of the week was such that we had sessions in the room until about 1 or maybe even 2 each day. And then the idea is, because of the diversity of forest growing environments in Australia that I referred to earlier, then we would spend the afternoons going on a 2 or 3 hour visit to local plantations or points of interest that reinforced some of the things that we were talking about in class, but also demonstrated the local silviculture. And on this particular logging coupe, we had Hancock Victorian Plantations presenting on the growing of Pinus radiata just here in the hills around Creswick. And that discussion, we had to stop it after about an hour or an hour and a half. It just kept going because of the, I guess, the fine detail that the group wanted to know about. So that was a very successful component of the online, oh, sorry, of the residential teaching week. We discovered during the week for this forest carbon course that it's incredibly detailed process that the Australian government requires for anyone to register for what's called an Australian Carbon Credit Unit. And there are many, many overlapping layers of legal, environmental, and technical information that needs to be put into an application for registering your ACCUs for sale. And we got an insight into that through the consulting expert here, Dr. Hugh Stewart, who has been working as an auditor for the Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme over the last couple of years. We also took the opportunity in our afternoons to visit other research groups here on the Creswick campus, and here it's the FLARE research group with Dr. Alex Filkoff here demonstrating the combustion of fuels and then what happens in terms of energy release and the creation of firebrands that distribute fires. So local plantations, local environmental issues, and in-house research at the site of the residential teaching week will be components of every course within this master, so that it really is helping to build the knowledge and networks of the students in the group, who quite often may come from a plantation site. This fellow here, Adam, works with 2 of his colleagues who are in the group as well, but they're sitting maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours from Brisbane in a forestry office and not getting a lot of interaction with researchers or with other types of forestry. So for them, it's really a big learning experience to be able to come back into the classroom, so to speak. So I don't expect you to read all of this, but you may be interested in the structure of the course, and I've given 2 days of a 5-day program here just to show the run of short presentations from experts, time for discussion. That's very important. We were leaving 45 minutes for discussion and we had no problem using that. And we might have 1 or 2 or 3 speakers, short discussion, and then a long discussion after the presentations. Morning tea was important. And then in the afternoon, we would have either another session followed by lots of touring, as I've just explained, getting outdoors. So in terms of my experience with the forest sector and engaging with it, very positive. I think that this style of education and the input of industry to, I guess, forming up and nominating the students into these programs seems to have worked in the first 2 subjects, and it certainly seems to have worked for the first couple of subjects in the second round offer this year. And I think when word gets around, I think more industry players will join in, and hopefully the program will run for at least the first 5-year period as a demonstration of what can be done using the existing expertise within universities that have taught forestry programs in the past, and perhaps bringing forward the need for the reinvigoration of a more standard forestry courses, perhaps in 1 or 2 of these universities, once this interest is demonstrated. Of course, what we don't know is whether there is interest directly coming from people enrolling into undergraduate programs at the level that would warrant some specialisation being created within the forest science, within the Bachelor of Science, for example, at Melbourne, or perhaps a specialist forestry named degree at one of the other universities. So I'll stop there and I'll stop sharing so I can see you all. And yeah, just pause for any discussion or questions that may arise.
So, Chris, thank you very much for that fascinating account. There's certain elements of déjà vu in some of that. And it seems that Australia as a whole has been trying to reinvent forestry education for maybe 20 years, if not longer. Do you think that we should forget about trying to teach forestry as a standard undergraduate program, and that we should move to a much more technical approach that maybe is diploma-based, like Switzerland has adopted, for example, and just forget about the standard undergraduate approach?
John, I think we've already moved to that. Perhaps there are a few dinosaurs like me around who think that, yes, maybe one day we can have undergraduate degrees that have specialist forestry subjects within them. I'll throw this one to Mark in a moment, but I think the best way to go for the foreseeable future, coming up over the next 5 years, is to go for these highly targeted specialist programs that really address directly what industry wants, what the employers want. And the question is, what happens in the meantime in terms of the skills base within universities, the professors in your language, as long as we've got professors that know about GIS and forest related applications and forest soils and forest biodiversity and ecology, as long as all of that expertise is there and that there is some research that addresses those issues in a forestry context, then there'll always be the opportunity to build off that with these specialist courses, yeah, with the addition of some external expertise coming in, yeah. But yeah, I think you're right, John. We've already done it. And I'll throw to Mark at this point.
Thanks, Chris. Look, I don't think I can add anything to what you've already presented, really. I just reinforce what what you've already said. Other than, I suppose, to say I've been I've been genuinely positively surprised at the success of this model so far. The engagement of the students, the apparent enthusiasm of industry, and the success of the model has been in such stark contrast to the things that we've tried over the past couple of decades. So, my short answer to your question, John, is yes. I think perhaps if we haven't already, we do need to embrace a model closer to the Swiss and really stop clinging on to older models that we may view fondly, but perhaps whose time has passed.
Thank you. That's really interesting because I was sitting in a Zoom meeting for a faculty council meeting, and they were saying how successful our online diploma programs were and how they were basically keeping the faculty afloat. And then the next line it was, but we can't possibly consider abandoning our undergraduate programs, even though the enrollment is declining and there's no one doing it. So very interesting. Okay, so can I throw it open to others? I see Guang Yu has unmuted. Maybe he has a question.
Hi, Chris. What's the AI? What kind of AI played a role in forest education in Melbourne?
Okay, just to repeat the question, Guang Yu, I think you're asking what's the role or how have we handled AI in forestry education? Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's an evolving space. So to relate my personal experience, teaching the agroforestry course that I mentioned last year to the first group of students who were predominantly not from Australia, but English was a second language. I've never seen such high quality work come from a group of students as we got last year. And we really had no systems in place to advise the students. We asked them to acknowledge the use of AI. And, we have software that tells us, what percentage AI they think, or what percentage a large language model has contributed to a document. So, we had no hard and fast rules last year, but we're certainly being encouraged to follow a more kind of prescribed set of rules this year. But I think the only answer is that we need to embrace AI and to ask the students to use it, and then perhaps we would then get them to assess what AI says, so they could critique it. But I tried that with the group last year, not in this external course that I've just been talking about, but some of the students were offended that they would have to use AI. AI was a dirty word, and it wasn't something that they wanted to engage with. And I had to respect that last year, but I'm not sure that we'll be able to do that in the future. I think AI is here to stay, and we need to find effective ways to embrace it, teach with it, and improve the quality of learning. Now, exactly how we do that, I'm unsure of. Yeah. I should say, Guang Yu, what's your experience? What's been happening at UBC, or perhaps from some others in the Zoom room?
Yeah, at UBC we are it's quite mixed. Some professors encourage them using the AI, some don't. It's quite mixed right now. So.
Yeah, I will say that we've just all the academic and the professional staff of Melbourne University have been rolled into a 4-session AI education session. And I've been to the first one, and I was really stunned at the origins and what AI can do and what it can't do. And it's important for people who are educators in a tertiary context to come to grips with exactly what AI is. And, you know, I'm looking forward to the next 3 sessions because in using AI, apparently there's a lot of importance put on the questions that you ask, how you cue AI to have the best chance of giving you something useful. So there are ways of doing that. I don't know them, but for those of you who are interested in using AI, I suggest learning about it somehow.
Yeah, you might also make sure that you are consistent with your national regulations or university regulations. University of BC has banned DeepSeek.
Yeah, look, we are living in a rapidly changing world in tertiary education. It's hard for some people, for both students and educators, to keep up and to even know what the rules are. So, John, you know, I think the chance of there being some sort of nationally coordinated response to AI's use in tertiary education in Australia, I think maybe it's easy to ban something, but actually to regulate how it is used is a different step altogether. Yeah.
Yeah, I did respond to that particular email saying that do they know the story of King Canute sitting on the beach with the instruction to stop the tide coming in?
That's pretty much
It didn't
what
work.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
other questions? Let's just check the chat. There's
Bruce?
one question in the chat. My field is chemistry. Do you have any course for this field?
Not within the program that I believe is being designed, and Mark may correct me, but there would likely be chemistry, and I assume it would be environmental chemistry that would be the field that may be offered elsewhere in the University of Melbourne, but I don't think chemistry features largely in anything other than soils components and perhaps some basic chemistry and physiological components of some of the courses that are being constructed. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question from one of the long-term APF Education Network participants, Bruce Manley from New Zealand.
Yeah, thanks, John. And thanks, Chris, for your presentation. Interesting to hear what's going on there. The question I have is to do with the resourcing of it in terms of the funding. I suppose it's fairly intensive, no doubt, and obviously the companies are providing a lot of input to it, which is great. But in terms of the seed money, there presumably there's some seed money you got from somewhere.
You mean for use within the teaching environment, Bruce,
or like the field trips, for
going?
example? There, who's funding the students to come on the 1 week course there, for example? Who's sponsoring the development of it? Is FWPA or Australian government? Are they in on this? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll throw this one to Mark, but I'll just say that all of the expenditure within the subject, so the local transport and all of the costs of the education locally, are handled within what we call a subject budget, which you're familiar with, no doubt. So that side of it is handled within the university and uses the fraction of the coursework fees to fund it. But in terms of, you know, sending the students to Creswick from Queensland and, you know, wherever else it might be, that's all borne by the forestry industry. But Mark, please comment further. Yeah.
Great question, Bruce. Thanks, Chris. So we're thinking about it in three parts here. There's the development of the course itself to go through the university's academic approval system, which is a significant process, as those of us who work in universities know. And so there's been a grant from the Australian government through Forestworks, which coordinates a lot of the training for the sector, particularly VET training. And some of that money has been directed to that effort to put the course together and ensure that it meets all the requirements and goes through the university system. So that's government funding for that. The second part of it is each of the units that are being offered, and each of the units, the fees that are charged each participant go to the university offering that unit, and then it's up to that University of Melbourne in Chris's case, to work out how much of that Chris gets to spend on morning tea and other important parts of the residential school, and how much goes onto other important things like the Vice-Chancellor's office, and so that's individually held. And then the third part of it is the attendance by the participants at the residential school, and that is covered by the participants themselves, but through the sponsoring organisations. So we make it very clear to Company A that if they are providing 2 students to us, they need to be prepared to pay the fees for both of those students for each subject, and they need to be able to provide the financing of the students attending the residential schools. And that attendance, because they're held across in different states, most students will have to fly to get to at least 3, I suppose, out of the 4, and accommodation, all the rest of it. So it's going to cost $1,200 to $2,000 Australian for each of those, and the companies or other sponsoring organisations accept that that's part of the cost as well as the course fees.
It's great you've got the companies involved in such a positive way, isn't it? I think that's obviously one of the strengths of the process.
One of the it was great because when people signed up, things were looking very good. The industry was going really well, and of course we've had a downturn in the past 12 months, and so individual companies' profitability is not looking as good as it was. So the challenge will be to maintain that enthusiasm through this leaner period that we engendered in them during the period when they were doing well.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Just to add, if that's okay, sorry, Chris. I think one of the key things is being able to have conversations with the right people. That there are existing training budgets. Most companies have training budgets, and most organisations have training budgets. And once we sit down and have a conversation about what's already being invested and how, and whether or not that could be better directed to what we're doing, that's a much more profitable conversation than walking in with an open palm and asking for people to find new money. So I think it's a matter of being clever about how we frame this conversation with our industry and other stakeholders, and see how they can see it as just a different way of doing what they normally do to get an even better outcome.
So Chris and Mark, and you say they have training budgets, but I suspect that they don't have training budgets that would enable them to send their employees for a 4-year degree residential program.
Yeah, I doubt that, John. And I think picking up on Mark's comment, some of the people involved in the discussion to get this initiative going were those training, well, I believe they were those training directors within the companies. And whilst they were enthusiastic, it relied on them really to relay the message and what had been agreed to their CEOs, so that the CEOs aren't ambushed when it comes to budget time and who's doing what. So I think Mark has learnt a lot, as he's just relayed to us, about how to approach industry, how to offer a constructive way for them to use resources that they currently may be directing in a slightly different way. And then to ensure that the message is well massaged across the top brass, or the people who make the decisions within that company. I'll also add that while Mark was here in Creswick last year in October, just through conversation, I said, oh, yeah, we had a go at something like this before. And indeed, in 2015, 16 and 17, we had on our books something that looks exactly what Mark is now creating through the University of Tasmania. And we didn't get one enrolment. And the missing ingredient really was going to industry to say, hey, we've got this, we've designed it specifically for you. We've set it up in a way to make it easily accessible for your people to come in. But we didn't do that part of it. We expected the message to get out, but it didn't. So the course was taken out of the books.
Hi, Chris. Can I also have one question for you?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the presentation to give us some internal view from the Australian forest sectors. So can you give us more information about the new trends or new requirement from the industry in Australia? So yeah, except what you mentioned, maybe there is a requirement for the deep professional training. Can you give us a more summary about this new requirement or new trends?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, Susie, I think that's reflected in the subjects that are being, I guess, created to address industry needs. Now, a subject that's called carbon forestry is directly addressing a new trend in industry, which is that fixed carbon is now a product. It's now something that can be bought and sold on national and international markets. And the industry found itself wanting to know more about how this carbon trading can happen and how they can access it to enhance their business, their enterprise. So the carbon forestry subject is an example of a trend in industry, which is that we're not just growing trees for saw logs and pulpwood and poles and posts. We're also growing it to fix CO2 into a product that will hold it for at least 25 or 100 years in the case of Australia. Now, you could also argue that the other subjects will really address the industry need to come to grips with new technologies that are rapidly emerging, not just in forestry, but across all sorts of industries, for advances in mechanization and the application of robots and robot technology for planting, for example. I'm sure that large language models and AI will be applied to accessing literature resources to improve fertilizer regimes or even spacing techniques and so on. So we're living into an age of rapid change in technologies that will improve the quality of forestry, and the people that are in the industry at the moment need to be given time to catch up with those developments, to learn how to apply them, or to at least learn the theory of them, so that they can get the right people in the future to help them in that regard, or develop the skills from the people that are already there. So I would see these subjects and the focus of this 4-subject diploma really is a reflection of where we're going in forestry with new technologies, as well as filling in gaps for graduates that might come out of agricultural or more generalist degrees, and giving them some of that specialist forestry knowledge as well. So I think it's covering that spectrum. Yeah. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Susie, but
yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Chris, isn't that what the Masters was designed to do 15 years ago?
Yes, John.
So why didn't that work?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question. And I think at Melbourne, the nature of our postgraduate coursework programs is decided by an associate dean, and we had a change in associate deans. We had a change in leadership. And I think, you know, forestry was not seen as something that the university wanted to be associated with because of its association in the media as a fairly negative enterprise. And the forestry word was taken out and replaced by ecosystem science to sort of soften it. But ironically, all of the expertise that supported forestry and forest science still exist within the university, but we haven't named it anywhere as such. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
Could I add, John? I think one of the things there is a graduate certificate is much more bite-sized than a master's, and that's important for the student cohort and also for the sponsoring organisations. That the idea that, and ideally we'll develop this further so that a person can do a single unit as a standalone micro-credential. And that gives people a chance to dip their toe in the water, get a feeling for whether or not the investment is worth their time and money, whether they're getting what they want out of it, whether or not it's something that suits them and they have the time. So I think a person who can see that they can do a unit and then go, yes, I think I'll now do a graduate certificate and do 3 more, and yes, I think I'll now go on and do some others and get a graduate diploma and work their way up to a master's, is a very different proposition to both an individual and a company making the commitment to a 2-year coursework program full time.
Okay. So we are coming close. No one else is asking questions. I feel a bit like I'm hogging it. But I do have a question, another one, and that is when we look at what's going on around the world, we see overseas aid budgets being slashed by many countries. US is the prime example, but Britain has slashed its overseas aid budget. Australia has had a fairly big program of supporting forestry in other countries, which brings in potential people into your program. Do you see that as being threatened? And is your program really focused now pretty well entirely on the Australian market? Or do you still see room for people from PNG or Southeast Asia in the program?
I'll provide a short answer there, John, and then perhaps hand to Mark again. But this particular, let's call it forestry sector program that's being brought forward and will be realised through the University of Tasmania speaks to people who are employed within the Australian industry at the moment. So they will not be impacted by foreign aid or aid budgets. As Mark's just alluded to, they're more impacted by, you know, the price of wood on international markets and their current profitability. Speaking to the University of Melbourne's programs that bring in a lot of forest-related students from the places that have received foreign aid, I really don't know. There doesn't seem to be any slowdown in students coming in at the moment to our Master of Ecosystem Management and Conservation, for example. It's pretty steady, but most of the students will come into the more generalist Master of Environment and then flow into our subjects from there. And if anything, that's building rather than declining. So it's not aid related, it's more related to the aspirations of parents for their children in places like China and India and elsewhere. Yeah. Mark, I'm not sure if you want to have a crack at providing a perspective on that.
I'd only had a perspective from the work that I've been doing in the Pacific the last few years. Certainly, this model is seen as something that's attractive to colleagues I'm working with in places like Fiji National University and the Forestry Department ministries in some of the countries we work in. So yes, it's seen as a good model. It's seen as an opportunity for engagement between those jurisdictions and Australia, and the challenge will be to identify a mechanism by which we can get students supported to participate in this program. So ACR, for instance, which is an organisation I'm sure many people will be familiar with, is undergoing a massive restructure at the moment, quite independently of other nonsense. And so that creates an opportunity to have conversations. I think the other side of it is that this is an enterprise that's very much impact focused, and it's got demonstrable outcomes that industry is happy to talk about. So I think if we can't find ways to engage even a diminishing funding pool of that sort of aid money to assist in the education of some of our colleagues in those countries, then we're probably not trying hard enough. So I see a lot of relevance.
Very interesting. Thank you. Okay, well, it is just after 8 o'clock. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Chris Weston for giving what I found to be a very stimulating presentation. Very interesting. As I said, certain elements of déjà vu in it. I'm really fascinated by the way Australia tries something, and if it doesn't work, it moves on to try something else. There's a lot of places around the world that just try and flog a dead horse, and it doesn't work, and they have gone under as a result. So congratulations to Chris and University of Melbourne, University of Tasmania, for all the work that you're doing, for engaging with industry, which I know is incredibly difficult. And I wish you the best of luck. Thank you.
Thanks for those kind words, John. A pleasure to speak to this forum. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Over
you.
to you, Susie.
Yeah, so we can finish. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Susie. Good night, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Chris.
Good night, good morning, good day, whatever.